The struggle for women's suffrage is really history at its best. It's dramatic and surprising, it's joyous and sad, yet ultimately the determination of the suffragists make this one of the most inspiring stories in American history. Here we go. The first Women's Rights Convention was held in a small Methodist chapel in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. The goal was to draft a woman's Declaration of Independence, and in 1848, the attendees had their work cut out for them. As second-class citizens, women had no rights to own property, no access to education, no rights to the custody of their children, no rights to the safety of their own bodies. Spousal abuse was perfectly legal in some states. Women were so confined by law and custom, just a suggestion of women's rights was considered blasphemy. The organizer of the convention was 32-year-old Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who'd been a revolutionary all her life, fighting for the advantages afforded to her brothers. At the 1848 convention, the group of 300 women and men, largely abolitionists, passed one resolution after another in support of women's rights. Then Stanton demanded a resolution on women's right to vote, and she created an uproar. Stanton said, "Nothing short of this right will secure the rights of all others." It was a radical idea. What was at stake wasn't just the right to vote, but a whole system of customs that defined men and women's roles in the world. Arguments went on for hours until abolitionist Frederick Douglass rose in support. His words convinced those assembled that a true democracy demanded men and women, Black and white, standing united for a better nation. Reaction to the convention's resolution in favor of women's suffrage was mostly negative, but it launched a wave of suffrage meetings that would expand in size and location for the next 70 years. One attendee at an early meeting was a restless school teacher from Rochester, New York, a young Quaker named Susan B. Anthony. She was a powerful speaker, statuesque, with a commanding voice that was always dignified and concise. She took a simple message from coast to coast. Women must have full rights of citizenship, most basically, to be treated like human beings. Stanton was divided between raising a family and raising a revolution. Stanton stayed home and raised 6 children. She wrote speeches and published articles, while Anthony became the face of the movement. For 10 years, leaders worked with abolitionist leaders like Sojourner Truth. When the Civil War erupted, suffrage leaders saw the promise of independence, not just for Black men, but for women as well. When the war was over, Stanton and Anthony refused to support the 15th Amendment because it did not include voting rights for women. Abolitionists condemned Stanton and Anthony as radicals, even racists. Defiantly, Stanton and Anthony founded a new organization, the National Women's Suffrage Association. In 1872, suffragists challenged the Constitution. On election day, Susan B. Anthony went to the polls and convinced a young male poll worker to let her vote. Later that day, she was arrested at her home for the crime of voting. She insisted on being taken away in handcuffs. The trial itself was a sham. On the first day, the judge entered the courtroom with his guilty verdict all written out and in his pocket. Eventually, the all-male jury agreed with his verdict. Anthony was declared guilty and fined $100. But the judge made one big mistake. He asked the accused if she had anything to say before sentencing. To the delight of the media, Anthony gave the court an earful and went on to demand women's right to vote under the Constitution as citizens of the United States. A year later, the Supreme Court ruled that while the Constitution considered women to be citizens, only the states could define their right to vote. Anthony said, "We must buckle on our armor and battle for women's rights wherever the battle is to be fought." With Stanton's advice, Anthony began campaigning from Maine to California, educating, organizing, and energizing women. After 40 years of campaigning, only one state, Wyoming, entered the Union as a suffrage state in 1890. While most men resisted giving women the right to vote, the realities of frontier life put men and women on more equal footing. If there was any hope at all for suffrage, it appeared to be in the West. The suffragists in Western states needed organizers, speakers, and literature. The National Women's Suffrage Association sent a tough 35-year-old Iowan, Carrie Chapman Catt. She was the movement's best organizer and a thrilling orator. She famously rode a railroad handcart down a mountain in Colorado in order to make it to a meeting at the bottom of the mountain on time. She said, "Somehow I arrived, hatless and breathless and ready to give my speech." 20 years later, this fearless and determined woman founded my organization, the League of Women Voters. Organizers like Catt encouraged Western suffragists to focus on specific groups. Laborers, farmers, miners, church organizations form coalitions with the classic political bargain: you help us, we'll help you. One of the most powerful partners was the Women's Temperance Union, horrified by the abuse suffered by women and children at the hands of drunken men. The group's eventual goal was to outlaw the sale of alcohol. So the Temperance Partnership then would enlist one of the movement's strongest opponents, tavern owners and the vast scope and power of the liquor industry. In 1910, California suffragists employed the same methods as organizers in other states, and they were creative. They traveled in convertibles and spoke from their cars. They created postcards, playing cards, and shopping bags. They had organizers in every part of California. Maria de Lopez served as a Spanish translator for the movement and was the first woman to give a speech in Spanish in support of women's suffrage. But the tavern owners in the large coastal cities were successfully campaigning against California suffrage. Proposition 4 was on the California ballot in 1911, granting Californians women the right to vote. The proposition passed, but only because inland counties like Riverside supported suffrage. But opposition to the suffrage movement nationwide was as stubborn as ever. The anti-suffrage women were society ladies. They believed their ability to shape the world rested in their identity as women. Women were the guardians of morals and civility and should not be corrupted by the unseemly world of politics. The anti-suffragists became a well-financed national organization and would oppose suffrage to the very end. "It's too bad," Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, "that these women are begging to be left in their chains." At the end of the century, a new group of suffragists emerged, African-American club women. They were an elite group, educated and middle class. These women argued that Black women needed the vote more than white women, because without it, they would be continually discriminated against. Mary Church Terrell was the outspoken leader of the African-American Women's Club movement. She was an educator and reformer, and one of the few African-American suffragists that Susan B. Anthony asked to speak at events. Terrell pleaded with the white suffragists to include the injustices against Black women in their lists of resolutions. But Terrell's plea found little support. Suffrage leaders were focused on wooing Southern white members and found it best to abandon their Black sisters. The club women did not give up. With the active support of African-American men, they built a movement that would grow to 500,000, but they would never find acceptance among mainstream suffragists. At the turn of the century, profound change was coming to women's lives. Women gained rights to education, property, ownership, and custody of their children. Greater numbers were in the labor force and actively participating in progressive labor and social reforms. But the suffrage movement was in a rut. Elizabeth Cady Stanton passed away in 1902. Anthony followed 4 years later. The movement needed new, more modern methods if it was to move forward. The answer came from Harriet Blatch, one of Stanton's daughters and a dedicated socialist. She advocated open-air tactics, take it to the streets, talk to the people one-on-one. Better yet, hold a parade. Parades turned out to be a powerful tool, not only demonstrating the size and dedication of the suffrage movement, but also convinced men that women were well organized, strategic, not frivolous or weak. But as awareness grew, so did opposition. Years of progressive reform brought more men to the suffrage camp, but the attitudes of most men had never really changed. Men were fearful, and they had good reason. Suffrage was a redefinition of roles of men and women. Men could see their identity changing, and it was a frightening idea. Factory owners who did not want to improve wages or working conditions for women saw an opportunity to play on men's fears and began spending money on anti-suffrage propaganda. However, the tide was turning in London. The British suffragists had adopted militant civil disobedience, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, whose motto was deeds, not words. On the scene was Alice Paul, a 22-year-old scholarly Quaker from New Jersey. Paul was wholeheartedly swept into the movement. She was arrested 3 times and suffered harsh prison terms. She joined other prisoners in a hunger strike and was fed by force. She wrote to her mother that she was tied to a chair because she struggled as doctors forced a tube 5 feet long through her nose. One of the results of torture is radicalization, and Alice Paul was radicalized. At age 28, she would return to the United States and revolutionize the American suffrage campaign. In 1913, Alice Paul and her colleague, Lucy Barnes, staged a glorious pageant in Washington, D.C., right down Pennsylvania Avenue, and the day before Woodrow Wilson was sworn in as president. The theme was to suggest the free women of the future and emphasize women's contributions to society. It was to be a moving, beautiful spectacle with Washington, D.C. as the backdrop. Some 8,000 suffragists participated, delegations of every kind, progressive men, Black women, everyone from coast to coast. As the parade progressed, some men began heckling on the sidewalks. They rushed the street, creating a melee of marchers and angry observers. One marcher asked a policeman for help and was told, "Nothing would have happened if you'd stayed home." The U.S. cavalry was called in to restore order. Not a single rioter was arrested. The riot received nationwide media attention. Alice Paul took advantage of the negative press and began an organized effort to lobby Congress for women's suffrage. 1 month later, crowds gathered outside the Capitol as a Western senator and congressman introduced a constitutional amendment declaring the right to vote shall not be denied on account of sex. Alice Paul named it the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. In 1916, shifts in the political winds equaled hope for the suffrage movement. Jeanette Rankin was elected to Congress from Montana. President Wilson announced he would support suffrage, but only by state action. Carrie Chapman Catt became the president of the National Suffrage Association. At 57, she was a seasoned and skillful leader, determined to organize and unite the suffrage troops in the states in military fashion. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Catt advocated that suffragists should both support the war effort and continue to lobby for suffrage. For Alice Paul, there was only one goal: women's suffrage. Her plan: enlist a perpetual delegation of picketers around the White House 6 days a week. Initially, they were to remain dignified and silent, but militants escalated the campaign. Banners mocked the president, calling out Kaiser Wilson, who valued freedom for foreigners over freedom for American women. Carrie Chapman Catt and the National Suffrage Association were horrified by the pickets, but worse, the picketers incited violence in some men who found the demonstrations un-American, subversive, and even treasonous. As local law enforcement looked the other way, the women were frequently attacked, attacks that made the front page news. President Wilson decided the women had to go. During the summer and fall of 1917, women began being arrested, charged with obstructing traffic. One group of women would be arrested, only to be replaced by another that would be arrested as well. Women of all ages were sent to prison for weeks and months. They weren't allowed mail or visitors. Many were at hard labor from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Prisoners reported being fed food with worms and insects, along with rotting horse meat. It did not break their spirit. Many returned to the picket lines and were arrested over and over. Alice Paul was sentenced to 7 months. In solitary confinement, she went on a hunger strike and was force-fed 3 times a day. 30 prisoners joined her in the strike. They were forced to lie on stone floors, some very ill with high fevers. Authorities only increased their brutality until the women's treatment reached the outside world. The publicity was pervasive, and angry mail began pouring into Congress. Once again, the power of public opinion called the authorities to give in. All the prisoners were released. In all, 168 women were arrested and tortured for silently picketing the White House. Now, in the fall of 1917, the power of public opinion was on the suffragist side. Politicians were well aware of increased public support for suffrage and the big increase in women voters from states like New York that had recently passed suffrage. The House of Representatives scheduled a vote on the Susan B. Anthony Amendment for January 10th, 1918. The dedication of some men to the cause should not be overlooked. On the day of the vote, 3 congressmen left sick beds to vote for suffrage. One was carried in on a stretcher. A 4th left his wife's deathbed to vote. That congressman cast his vote and left the House floor to go to the funeral home. The 2/3 majority passed, but just by 1 vote. If just one of those men had not shown up to vote, the amendment would have failed. The amendment passed the Senate in June 1919, again by just 1 vote. But next, the biggest fight of all. 36 legislatures now had to ratify the amendment. Each time a state would ratify, Alice Paul sewed a star on her victory banner. By March 1920, she had 35 stars. The movement was forced to turn to the South and the state of Tennessee. The quiet town of Nashville became ground zero for an all-out political battle. One suffragist said that just because you had a legislative vote in the morning didn't mean you'd still have it by nightfall. Suffragists were sure legislators were being bribed by factory owners and the liquor interests as they saw their support fall away. Having kept a careful tally throughout, suffragists went to bed the night before the vote, feeling certain they would lose by just 1 vote. Harry Byrne, 24 years old and the youngest member of the legislature, always wore a red rose in his lapel, a signal that he was anti-suffrage. When Byrne voted yes, he sent shockwaves through the State House. It took the suffragists a few moments to realize that his vote had broken a tie and passed the amendment. Everyone assumed Harry Byrne must have been bribed in some way. But no, he'd gotten a letter from his mother, which he carried in his pocket. She told him to be a good boy, help Mrs. Catt, and vote for women's suffrage. So the struggle for suffrage came to an end in part because a young man from Mouse Creek, Tennessee, did what his mother asked him to do. 20 million American women had won the right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt wrote, "The vote is won. For 72 years, the battle for this privilege has been waged, but human affairs with their eternal change move on without pause. Progress is calling you. Take no pause. Act." And here we are 100 years later. This is progress, where women not only cast ballots, but see their names on the top of them. So let's celebrate the women who fought for our right to vote by making sure we exercise it this November. Thanks very much.